Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 19 stories for you, including the architecture of waiting, the ribs of the Tomorrow app, the passenger in the last row, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The architecture of waiting. The maintenance log for offshore Platform 49 was updated with a series of observations regarding the atmospheric anomalies encountered during the Great Gale. It was noted that as the wind reached its peak velocity, the rhythmic humming of the turbine blades began to syncopate with an unexpected secondary vibration. This resonance was first identified by the solo technicians stationed in Pod A. A persistent auditory hum was reported, which felt less like a mechanical friction and more like a low-frequency respiration. It was during this period that the arrival of the birds was recorded. At first, it was observed as a mere cluster of white gulls perched upon the reinforced steel rafters of the pod's ceiling. By the second day, the count increased. By the fourth, they were no longer merely perched. They were huddled in tight, overlapping layers, their feathers damp with salt spray but strangely motionless. They did not cry out. They simply waited. It was noted that the birds appeared to be reacting to something invisible above them. On the seventh day, the number of birds reached a threshold where the weight of their bodies caused the rafters to groan under the pressure. They were stacked in a dense canopy, their heads all angled toward the center of the ceiling as if observing an unmoving point. It was during the 10th night that the crouched form was first detected by the technician's flashlight beam. It was positioned directly above the sleeping bunk, suspended just inches from the rafters. The entity was described not as a solid object, but as a collapsed geometry of velvet and bone. It lacked the typical symmetry of a creature. Its body was a series of overlapping folds, resembling a heavy quilt made of thick, mossy fur. Its limbs were tucked inward, held close to its core in a state of profound compression. Each morning, it was observed to have unfolded slightly further into the air. The process was described as a slow unfolding, as if the entity were being remembered into shape by the sheer weight of the bird's collective attention. By the 14th day, the form had risen from a crouch to a semi-erect posture. Its texture was revealed to be iridescent, shifting from deep plum to copper depending on the angle of the light. It did not have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it possessed a series of concentric ridges that rippled like water whenever it moved. The technician reported that the birds began to fall one by one, their bodies hitting the floor with soft thuds as if they were being sacrificed. Each time a bird fell, the entity would expand another inch upward, its velvet skin stretching thin until it became translucent. It was observed to move with a deliberate, fluid grace, never rushing, but always progressing. By the final day of the storm, the unfolding was nearly complete. The entity had stretched into a towering, arched pillar of texture and curve, its ridges vibrating in harmony with the wind outside. It reached toward the ceiling, its tip brushing against the steel beams. The birds were gone, replaced by a shimmering residue on the rafters. In the final hour of the gale, the technician sat perfectly still as the entity performed its last movement. It did not bloom like a flower or stand like a man. It simply expanded until it occupied the entirety of the pod's headspace. As the wind died down and the silence returned, the entity reached out one final time, its velvet surface rippling like a disturbed pond. The technician recorded that as they watched, the entity finally ceased its expansion and began to press downward, flattening against the ceiling with a sound like a heavy sigh. It was noted that when the lights were finally switched off, the weight of the pod felt heavier than before, as if something massive had settled into the very marrow of the steel. The technician observed that, even in total darkness, the sensation of being watched remained. When the morning light hit the rafters, it was found that the entity had not disappeared, it had simply folded itself back into a dense, singular point, waiting for the next storm to call it out. The ribs of the Tomorrow app. I'm telling you, this isn't just a ghost story. I lived it. It happened 3 years ago during a rain-slicked week in October when I stayed at the Grand Meridian. The hotel was almost empty, save for one other guest on the floor above mine who occasionally left their door slightly ajar. By 10 p.m., the lobby had fallen into a heavy, velvet silence, but the indoor pool area felt like a cathedral of echoes. The air there was thick and humid, carrying the faint scent of chlorine and damp stone. That's where it started. I was sitting by the water's edge, my legs dangling over the cool tile, scrolling through a new experimental app called Preview. It didn't show me what was happening now. It pushed notifications for what would happen exactly 24 hours into the future. At first, they were trivial and almost humorous in their simplicity. A cup of tea will spill, or you will hear a bird chirp. I spent the first hour chuckling at the mundane prophecies, watching the way the turquoise water reflected the dim overhead lights. But then, as the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew colder, and the app began to pulse with a rhythmic gold light that seemed to cast shadows against the walls. A notification popped up, different from the others. Something is watching from the water. I laughed, looking at my own reflection in the still surface. There was nothing there but the turquoise glow of the underwater lights and my own wide-eyed stare. Then another one appeared. It has opened its first rib. That's when the water began to ripple, not from a breeze or a stone, but from a concentrated pressure in the center of the pool. A sound like clicking would echoed against the high ceiling, a sharp, rhythmic click. Out of the depths rose an entity that looked as though it had been woven from the skeleton of 1,000 broken umbrellas. It didn't have skin or fur. It was a lattice of curved wooden ribs, overlapping like the scales of a fish, connected by threads of shimmering, translucent silk. It had no face in the traditional sense, but where a head should be, there was a central hub of interlocking spokes that rotated slowly with a soft whirring sound. As I sat paralyzed, my breath hitching in my throat, the app pinged again. It is reaching for the shore. The creature moved with a strange, jerky grace. It didn't swim so much as it unfolded. With every inch it gained toward me, its frame expanded. It started small, the size of a large beach ball, but as it approached my chair, its ribs pushed outward, making it the size of a carriage. The clicking sound intensified, a frantic clack-clack-clack of wood hitting wood, like 1,000 tiny fingernails tapping on an oak table. I felt the humidity in the air change, smelling faintly of old cedar and rain. The app flickered. It sees your pulse. My heart hammered against my ribs, matching the rhythm of its expansion. It was now towering over me, a skeletal dome of timber and silk that seemed to breathe. Each rib had a slight curve, like a thumbprint in wax, and they were all vibrating with a low-frequency hum. I realized then that it wasn't just moving toward me, it was blooming. The closer it got, the more its structure widened until it nearly brushed my shoulders, casting a sprawling shadow over my body. It was no longer an object in the pool, it was an environment. The silk threads between the ribs began to hum a low, mourning note that resonated in my very chest. I felt as though I were sitting inside a giant, wooden ribcage, waiting for its heart to beat. Just as I prepared to bolt for the exit, terrified by the sheer scale of it, the app gave one final, frantic notification. It is ready to fold. The creature suddenly jerked inward. All those hundreds of wooden ribs collapsed toward its center with a violent, synchronized snap, like a deck of cards being slammed into a stack. In a fraction of a second, it went from a massive canopy to a tight, dense sphere of wood and silk, perfectly compact. I didn't wait for it to move again. I scrambled up and ran until my lungs burned, the sound of the clicking would following me all the way to my room. The next morning, when I walked past the pool, the water was perfectly still. No ripples, no wood, no silk. But there, on the floor where it had stood, was a single wooden rib, perfectly curved and smelling of rain. The passenger in the last row. I am writing this from the seat of the midnight liner, though I suspect if you are reading these words, you have already reached the final stop. Most people think of an empty bus as a vessel of solitude, but they are wrong. On the overnight express route through the salt flats, the back rows do not truly stay empty. They simply host a passenger who hasn't been invited by the ticket counter. I sat in row 24, tucked into the very last corner where the velvet upholstery is frayed and smells of ancient dust. The hum of the engine was a steady pulse, but as we crossed the midnight mark, the silence changed. It became heavy, like water pressing against my eardrums. That was when I first felt the weight of the gaze. From the darkness behind my head, something began to manifest. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, it was more of a topographical anomaly in the air. At first, it was just a shadow that didn't belong to any object, but then it took shape. It sat in row 25, leaning forward as if about to whisper a secret. Its face was wide and textured like weathered limestone, with skin that rippled like the surface of a lake disturbed by a pebble. But its most striking feature was its mouth, a permanent, crescent-shaped grin that stretched from ear to ear. However, this wasn't a joyous smile. It was a dimness, a physical pool of twilight that sat deep in the creases of its lips. This dimness didn't just reflect light, it swallowed it, casting a faint, indigo glow on its chin. The entity had no hair and no distinct ears, only a crown of soft, velvet-like fuzz that caught the bus's interior amber light. As the bus lurched over a pothole, the entity leaned closer to my shoulder. I could feel the temperature drop by several degrees in its immediate vicinity. "Is it time yet?" it murmured, its voice sounding like two smooth stones grinding against one another underwater. The sound didn't come from its throat so much as it vibrated out of that deep, dim smile. It reached out a hand not with many joints, but with a palm as broad and flat as a paddle, tipped with blunt, rounded nubs instead of nails. It touched my sleeve, and where its skin met the fabric, the color bled away into a dull charcoal. I realized then that it wasn't just watching me, it was drinking me in. Every time I blinked, the dimness in its smile grew slightly wider, as if it were inhaling the very air around my face. The bus began to slow, the rhythmic thrumming of the tires turning into a low moan. We were entering the stretch where the road becomes a mirror of the sky. The entity stood up then, its body swaying with the motion of the coach like seaweed in a current. It moved toward the very back of the bus, where the floorboards end and the void begins. It didn't walk so much as glide, its limestone skin humming a low, melodic frequency. "The ocean is deep," it whispered, "and you are making such lovely ripples." I looked up at it, trying to find its eyes, but it had none, only two small pits of concentrated shadow that seemed to be receding into the dimness of its grin. It leaned down until its face was inches from mine, and for a moment, the entire bus felt as though it were submerged in a fathomless sea. The entity opened its mouth wider, and I saw that the dimness wasn't just a surface texture, it was an entrance. Inside that smile sat a miniature landscape of rolling hills and tiny, frozen trees, all bathed in a perpetual twilight. It wasn't a face at all, but a doorway. "Don't worry," it said, its voice now a resonant thrum that vibrated my ribcage. "The bottom is waiting for you." The bus finally ground to a halt with a shuddering groan. The doors hissed open, and the smell of wet earth flooded the cabin. I sat frozen, watching the entity take one last step toward me. It didn't wait for me to stand. It simply exhaled a breath of cool mist that tasted of salt and ancient secrets. Then, with a graceful tilt, it stepped out into the night, its dimness lingering in the air like a footprint. I stood up, my legs trembling, and realized that as it left, it had taken the light from my own shadow. The bus is still there, parked at the edge of the world, waiting for the next passenger to sit in row 24 and meet the thing that smiles with the depth of the abyss. The upward spill of the subterranean stair. The whiteout didn't just arrive, it swallowed us. One moment, we were surveying the jagged spine of the glacier with our equipment spread across the permafrost, and the next, the horizon vanished into a blinding, milky void. The wind became a physical weight, pressing against our tents until they groaned like dying whales. I huddled inside my shelter, the fabric shivering with every gust, watching the frost crystals dance in the dim lantern light. It was then that I heard it, a rhythmic, metallic thrumming coming from beneath the ice. It wasn't a geological shift or the groan of freezing water. It sounded like footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps walking down a flight of stairs deep within the frozen earth. I stepped outside, my goggles fogging instantly, and saw it, the staircase. It didn't belong in a glacier. It was a jagged spine of limestone and mossy stone rising out of the snow at a 45-degree angle, disappearing into the ground like a root growing downward. It looked as if someone had carved a path straight into the heart of the world. I began to descend, my boots crunching against the frost. The air grew warmer as I went deeper. Every 3 steps, the stairs seemed to widen, the stone becoming smoother and more polished. By the time I reached the 10th flight, the wind was silenced, replaced by a heavy, humid atmosphere that smelled of wet minerals and old velvet. That is when I saw the spell. It lived on the walls of the staircase. It wasn't a creature in the traditional sense. It was a mass of viscous, indigo ink that behaved with the logic of gravity inverted. While water would fall down to meet the floor, this dark fluid flowed upward along the stone, clinging to the surfaces like a velvet skin. It moved in pulses, rippling toward the ceiling as if trying to escape the ground. It didn't have a face or limbs. It was a sprawling, undulating pool of shadow that stretched and contracted. As I reached the bottom of the 3rd level, a ripple traveled through the spill. A globule of ink broke away from the wall and began to climb toward my chest, moving with the steady grace of an upward falling rain. It felt heavy against my skin, not wet like water, but thick like warm honey. I froze as it moved over my shoulder. It didn't just sit there, it explored. It flowed into the creases of my parka, seeking out every fold. The deeper I went, the more the spill reacted to my presence. It began to gather at the base of the stairs, rising higher with each breath I took, as if the staircase were a straw and the spill was being sucked toward me. By the 20th level, the walls were almost entirely submerged in this dark tide. The spill reached my head, coating my hair in a shimmering midnight sheen. It moved with a strange intelligence, pulsing like a heartbeat. It didn't want to eat me, it wanted to coat me. I realized then that the staircase wasn't just a path, it was an appetite. The deeper I descended, the more the spill expanded, growing thicker and darker until it felt like I was walking through a submerged forest of ink. My lantern flickered as the spill reached for the flame, drinking the light. Just as I thought I couldn't go any deeper, the stairs ended abruptly in a wide, circular chamber. The floor was perfectly flat, and the walls were completely vanished beneath the spill. I stood in the center, the dark fluid now draped over my shoulders like a heavy cloak, moving rhythmically against my skin. Then the movement stopped. The spill settled into a perfect stillness. I waited for it to move again, for it to leap or flow toward my mouth. Instead, the entire mass of ink suddenly surged upward in one synchronized motion, pinning me against the floor as if gravity had finally flipped completely. It didn't just cover me, it embraced me. The spill began to pulse with a low, vibrating hum that resonated in my teeth. As I lay there, the dark fluid began to seep into my pores, turning my skin the color of a bruised plum. I could feel it moving inward, traveling along my veins toward my heart. It wasn't just a shadow on a wall anymore. It was becoming part of my anatomy. The silence of the chamber was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing under the weight of the ink. Then, from the center of the spill covering my face, a single, tiny bubble of air broke the surface and popped. In that moment, I realized the spill wasn't just flowing upward toward the ceiling. It was flowing inward, trying to find a way into the only thing left in the room, me. The Chronos of the Deep. I have been tasked with relaying a peculiar account, not merely a set of facts, but a sensory testimony. The witness was a solitary night watchman, tasked with patrolling the Leviathan, a decommissioned submarine now serving as a subterranean museum. It is a hollow iron ribcage buried beneath the city streets, smelling of salt and old grease. He spoke to me in a voice that seemed to vibrate with an internal tremor, and I have transcribed his words while noting my own observations on the impossibility of his experience. The silence inside the hole is not empty, he began. It is heavy. It presses against your eardrums like water. He walked the spine of the ship past rusted periscopes and a cavernous mess hall where shadows stretched thin. For 3 hours, the metal hummed with the ghost of former propulsion. But as he reached the aft section, the stern, where the hull curves into a sharp point, the geometry betrayed him. I stepped into the observation gallery, he told me, his hands twitching. It is a small, oval chamber meant for viewing the abyss. But when I entered, the floor felt wrong. Instead of steel plates, the ground was velvet-covered marble. In the center stood an anomaly, a heavy, arched slab of bronze that appeared from nowhere. It wasn't on any blueprint. I reached out to touch it, he whispered. But as my palm neared the metal, I felt a draft, a freezing puff of air that smelled of crushed violets and ozone. He blinked. For a fraction of a second, his gaze drifted. When he looked back, the door was gone. That is when the first sensation of wrongness hit, he said. Not just the missing door, but the realization that the room had grown larger. The walls were further away, yet the ceiling felt lower. It was a spatial contradiction. He stood paralyzed in a pocket of existence, a hallway between worlds that had folded into the submarine's hull. Then it appeared. The entity, he said. It did not walk, it simply occupied space. A torso rose from the floor, the size of a human chest, but lacking a head or limbs. It was composed entirely of interlocking clock hands, hundreds of them, made of burnished brass and silver. They were frozen in place, pointing in every conceivable direction, like a metallic explosion of needles. Some were as thick as swords, others were thin as hair. They pulsed with a faint, golden luminescence. The strangest thing, he noted, was the timing. Every single hand was pointing at the exact microsecond that I had looked away from the door. It was as if it were capturing my lapse in attention. He moved closer. The hands began to vibrate. They didn't swing. They hummed with a low frequency that made his teeth ache. I felt like I was being judged by time itself, he said. The entity wasn't just a shape. It was a physical manifestation of my own momentary distraction. Then, the escalation peaked. He shifted his gaze to the far side of the room, and the torso reacted. The hands began to rotate with a violent, grinding sound, the screech of gears turning deep underground. They spun into a blur of gold and silver, carving grooves into the air like spinning saws. The walls were dissolving into a hazy amber mist, he told me, his voice dropping to a thready rasp. I was standing in a void where the only constant was this spinning mass of needles. He reached out. His fingers trembled. As his skin met the metal, a jolt didn't just shock his nerves, it yanked at his memories. For a second, he saw his own birth and his own death simultaneously. The torso let out a sound like 1,000 ticking watches synchronized into a single heartbeat. Then, with a final, deafening click, all the hands stopped instantly. They didn't point at the door anymore. They all pointed inward, toward his own chest. I stood there for a long time in the silence that followed, he concluded. The room solidified again. The bronze door reappeared, and the amber mist vanished. I was back in the Leviathan. He walked out of the gallery slowly, his breath hitching. He told me that when he returned to the surface that night, he could still hear it, a faint, rhythmic ticking coming from inside his own ribs. I am safe now, he said with a shaky smile. But I know what is there. However, as I listened to him finish, I noticed something about the way he held his hands. He kept them pressed against his sternum, as if holding something in place. He told me that when he looks into a mirror now, he doesn't see just his own face. He sees the faint, circular shadow of a second hand moving behind his ribs, ticking toward a moment that hasn't happened yet. I have been tasked with relaying a peculiar account, not merely a set of facts, but a sensory testimony. The threshold of the abyss. Please, begin by describing your current state of awareness, the doctor said. Her voice was muffled, as if she were speaking from behind a heavy velvet curtain rather than across the examination table. I took a breath, my lungs still feeling slightly heavy from the pressure of the deep, and looked at her. I am functional, I replied, but I am still processing the silence of the trench. The doctor nodded, her pen hovering over a clipboard that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Let us move to the specifics of the submersible. What did you see first when the engines died? I closed my eyes and felt the freezing weight of the water pressing against the titanium hull. For 3 days, we were suspended in the midnight zone, a tiny bubble of warmth in a desert of brine. The silence was absolute until the lights flickered. That was when I noticed the perimeter. At first, I thought it was a trick of the glare, a smudge on the reinforced glass, or perhaps a cluster of bioluminescent plankton. But as my headlamp swept across the silk-covered floor, something appeared at the very edge of the beam. It wasn't in the center. It was lurking in the periphery where the light died into shadow. I saw a blink. Then another. But they weren't synchronized. They were erratic, like a heartbeat that skipped beats or a strobe light with a faulty fuse. Describe the blinking, the doctor prompted. Her voice had grown slightly sharper. I tried to find the words. It was rhythmic, but inconsistent. One eye would snap shut while the other remained wide. Then, seconds later, they would both open, only for one to close again immediately. It felt like a sequence of independent thoughts happening in a single head. The doctor scribbled something down. And how did it move? I gripped the arms of my chair. It didn't walk. Not at first. It was just there, at the edge of my vision, just beyond where the lamp reached. Every time I tried to look directly at it, it retreated further into the gloom. It was a master of the periphery. The doctor leaned in. Tell me about its shape. My mind raced back to that final hour. It wasn't a ghost or a standard beast. It looked like a doorway had been torn out of the water and given limbs. Its body was a perfect, vertical rectangle of textured bark-like skin, ribbed with horizontal grooves as if it were a gate waiting to be swung open. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, its entire upper half was a crown of overlapping, iridescent scales that shifted from copper to teal. And then there were the eyes, two massive, amber spheres set into the middle of the rectangular frame, glowing with a soft, internal warmth. The doctor's pen stopped moving. What happened when it finally stepped forward? I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. The power surged for 1 second. I swung the headlamp directly onto its center. It didn't move like an animal. It moved like a fold in space. One moment it was a distant silhouette, a floating rectangle of texture, and the next, it stepped down out of itself. It collapsed inward, the rectangular frame flattening into a wide, flat plane, while the amber eyes expanded to fill the entire surface. It didn't walk toward me. It simply occupied more of the room. The doctor stood up and walked around the table. When it moved, did you hear it? I hesitated. It made a sound like heavy fabric being pulled across stone. A deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in my teeth. The doctor stopped behind me. And what happened when it reached your headlamp? I remembered the final sensation of the pressure cooker silence. It didn't just stand there. It mimicked. It took the shape of the light beam itself. It stretched its rectangular body until it was a long, thin ribbon of copper scales, wrapping around my head like a crown. And then the eyes. I looked at the doctor now, her face unreadable. The eyes stopped blinking independently. They began to blink in perfect unison with my own eyelids. When I closed mine, they shut. When I opened mine, they flew open. It was as if it were trying to synchronize its existence with mine. The doctor leaned down, her face inches from mine. And what did you feel in that moment of synchronization? My voice was a mere whisper. I felt the doorway opening inside my own skull. I realized it wasn't just standing in front of me anymore. It had stepped into me. I sat back, the silence of the room suddenly feeling heavier than the weight of the ocean. The doctor smiled, but her eyes remained fixed on mine. And now? She asked. Now, I whispered, every time I blink, I can feel something heavy and rectangular pressing against the inside of my forehead, waiting for me to open the gate. The luminous consumer of the shafts. Entry 1. The ventilation system in Sector 4 of the high-rise complex is no longer just a feat of engineering. It has become an ecosystem. We entered the main artery today at dawn. It is a massive, rusted iron lung that breathes for the entire tower. The walls are coated in a velvet layer of dust and dampness, smelling of old copper and wet stone. We were tasked with mapping the northern corridor, but the air feels heavy thick, as if it holds memories of every breath taken by the residents above. Entry 4. It began in Corridor C. We didn't see anything at first, only felt a shift in the pressure. The temperature dropped sharply, turning our breath into white plumes of mist. Then came the sound, a rhythmic, wet thrumming, like a giant heart beating against a hollow drum. It wasn't just noise, it was vibration. We found the source near the junction where the pipes split. A faint radiance pulsed from the shadows. Entry 7. We have encountered the luminary. It does not walk so much as it flows through the space, a mass of undulating, translucent membranes that resemble the wings of an oversized moth, but woven together like silk. It has no face in the traditional sense. Instead, it possesses a cluster of vibrating sensory pits arranged in a circle around a central core. It is beautiful and terrifying. It doesn't just occupy the shaft, it consumes the very essence of the space. Entry 9. The behavior of the luminary is fascinating. It feeds on charge, specifically, the thermal energy and kinetic potential of its surroundings. As it moved into our path, the shadows didn't just vanish, they were devoured. The closer it got to us, the darker the rest of the tunnel became. It was as if it were drinking the light from the walls to fuel its own inner fire. Its body pulsed with a golden, honey-like glow that intensified with every inch of progress. Entry 12. We realize today that we are not just observers. We are the buffet. The luminary noticed our bodies, our living warmth and moving pulses. It slowed its drift, stretching out its trailing membranes to taste the heat radiating from our skin. When it brushed past Elias, he gasped. "It feels like a warm summer breeze against my cheek," he whispered. But as it passed him, his arm turned brittle and cold, as if the heat had been sucked out of his marrow in a single heartbeat. Entry 15. The escalation began at noon. The luminary wasn't just drifting anymore, it was hunting. It moved with a predatory grace, its core spinning faster, turning from a soft gold to a searing, incandescent white. The silence of the shaft was broken by a high-pitched hum, the sound of energy being converted into motion. Every time it pulsed, the metal walls groaned and contracted. We retreated into a side alcove, huddling together as the entity surged forward, seeking the richest source of heat. U.S. Entry 18. It is now moving with terrifying speed. It doesn't leave footprints. It leaves scorched marks on the iron. The dust in the air has turned to frost at the edges of its reach and to ash at its center. We can hear it now, a low, hungry moan that vibrates in our chests. It isn't just eating our warmth, it is absorbing our momentum. I watched it catch a falling pebble from my hand. The stone didn't just stop, it glowed for a second before becoming perfectly still and freezing cold. Entry 20. We are cornered in the final expansion chamber of the northern wing. The luminary has grown larger as it fed on our proximity, its membranes now spanning nearly the width of the shaft. It is no longer a distant wonder, it is an imminent fact. It glows so brightly now that I can see every speck of dust suspended in the air, like tiny stars orbiting a sun. My hands are shaking, and my breath comes in short, shallow bursts. Entry 21. It reached us 5 minutes ago. It didn't strike with teeth or claws, it simply enveloped us in its radiant field. I felt the heat of its core press against my ribs, a searing, delicious warmth that felt like being wrapped in a heated blanket made of liquid light. My vision began to blur as the entity drank my internal temperature, pulling the life from my muscles and depositing it into its own shimmering body. Entry 22. The final entry. The shaft is now almost entirely dark, for the luminary has consumed every scrap of ambient heat and light we had left to offer. It sits in the center of the chamber, massive and steady, pulsing with a deep, satisfied radiance that illuminates its own vast shape. We are still here, standing close enough to feel its hum against our skin, but our bodies have become husks of lingering temperature. The entity is full now, yet as it rests, I can see its core flickering slightly, searching for the next spark of heat in a world that is slowly turning to ice. The Graphite Grin. Please, Mr. Henderson, just answer the question. Don't look at the ceiling, just look at me and tell us what you saw when you entered the hull of the U-402. I'll wait for you to gather your thoughts. Good. Now, describe the atmosphere of the submarine after the final group had departed. It was a hollow, metallic womb, wasn't it? You described it as smelling of salt and old grease, with that heavy, pressurized silence that only exists underwater. But then, you noticed the door. Just answer the question, sir. Which door? Yes, the aft bulkhead, the one we know had been bolted shut from the outside since the museum opened. You said it was impossible for anything to have entered that chamber during the night shift. And yet, when you arrived at dawn, the floor of the main corridor was no longer dry. You saw the footprints first. They were wet, glistening like slugs had traversed the steel, but they weren't random. They began precisely at the base of that locked door and marched toward the command deck in a straight, deliberate line. Tell us about the texture of these prints. Were they human? I just need you to answer the question. You described them as slightly elongated, with toes that seemed to have too many joints, each one leaving behind a bead of thick, viscous water that hadn't evaporated by morning. But it was the trail that unsettled you, the way they weren't perfectly uniform. Some were deep, as if the walker was heavy, and others were light, almost tentative, as if the entity were testing the very ground beneath its weight. Then you heard the sound. Just answer the question. What did it sound like? It wasn't a footfall. It was a rhythmic, wet clicking, like a tongue hitting the roof of a mouth, but multiplied by dozens. You followed the trail to the center of the command deck and stopped. The air there felt thicker, heavier, as if the oxygen had been replaced by something more humid. That is when you saw it standing by the periscope, the thing that had made the footprints. It didn't have a body in the traditional sense. It was a cluster of mass that hovered just inches off the floor. But its face, that was what haunted your deposition notes. Just answer the question. How would you describe the face? I need a clear visual for the jury. It wasn't skin or bone. It was a mosaic of pencils, hundreds of them, chewed by something with great hunger and sharpened down to needle-fine points. The wood was weathered, some bits splintered, others smooth as river stones. They were arranged in concentric circles around a central core, forming a face that shifted whenever it moved. There was no mouth, yet it spoke. It spoke by vibrating the graphite tips against one another, producing a dry, scratching sound that resonated inside your ribcage. You told the constable it felt like hearing 1,000 tiny teeth grinding on paper. When you first saw it, it stayed perfectly still, its pencil face pointing toward the door. But as you moved, it reacted. It didn't have eyes to blink. Instead, the pencils near the brow furrowed inward, creating deep grooves of shadow. You tried to back away, but the wet footprints began to appear in front of you, even though the entity hadn't moved yet. They were appearing in real time, as if it were projecting its path onto the floor like a ghost's blueprint. Then it began to move toward you. It didn't walk so much as slide, its pencil face tilting upward. You described the sound of its movement as the scraping of 1,000 pens across a chalkboard. It reached out, not with hands, but with a protruding cluster of 6 sharpened leads that acted as feelers. They touched your chest, and for a moment, you felt the vibration of its thoughts. It wasn't just a creature, it was an architect of marks. You told us it seemed to be writing your presence into its memory. And then, the final movement? Just answer the question. When it finally reached your face, what did it do? You froze as those sharp graphite tips moved toward your nose, and you felt a single, tiny pencil point. Press against your forehead. It didn't strike you, it simply stayed there, leaning in until its wood grain touched your skin. Then, the clicking sound stopped completely. The silence that followed was louder than any noise you had heard all night. You realized then that it wasn't just looking at you, it was measuring the depth of your thoughts. It withdrew its face and retreated toward the aft door, leaving a final set of footprints that were perfectly dry, as if it had sucked every drop of moisture back into its wooden heart. As you turned to leave, you felt a tiny prick on your brow where it had touched you. You reached up to touch the mark, but your hand trembled when you realized it wasn't a scratch, it was a smudge of wet graphite that hadn't been there before, and as you watched, the smudge began to slowly expand outward, as if something underneath your skin were still trying to write itself out. The observer in the frost. Step this way, travelers. Keep your voices low and your lanterns steady. The guide's voice is a hushed rasp, barely rising above the relentless whistle of the wind. We are moving beyond the mapped corridors of the valley and into the ridge itself, where the geography loses its familiarity. Most people think a storm is just weather, but here, in the heart of the blizzard, the snow acts as a veil. It hides what is waiting to be seen, masking the jagged edges of the earth with a soft, suffocating white shroud. You see that cave ahead? The guide gestures toward a yawning maw in the limestone. A natural sanctuary, carved by wind and ice over centuries. But today, we have added our own touch. We've placed a single security camera, a mechanical eye, at the mouth of this frost hollow. We enter the cave, and the transition is instantaneous. The chaos of the blizzard is replaced by a heavy, muffled silence. The snow outside muffles every sound until the world feels like a padded room, isolating us in a pocket of suspended time. Inside, the air is different. It smells of old minerals, damp earth, and frozen moisture that clings to your hair like tiny diamonds. You sit on a jagged ledge, the cold seeping into your bones through your cloak. Above you, mounted to the ceiling, hangs the camera. It is a sturdy thing, ironclad to resist the biting frost, its glass lens reflecting the flickering light of our lanterns. At first, the machine behaves as expected. It captures your silhouette against the white blur outside, recording the way your breath forms tiny clouds of steam. But as the storm intensifies, something shifts in the frame. The lens begins to pivot. It doesn't move with the erratic jerkiness of a loose hinge. There is no draft inside this hollow to push it. Instead, it moves with a deliberate, hydraulic smoothness. You watch it swing away from you, rotating toward the back corner where the shadows pool deepest, a place where the limestone curves into an impossible, yawning gloom. It seems to be searching for something that isn't visible to the naked eye yet. The camera tilts, then levels out. Then, the movement stops. The camera holds its position for a full minute, perfectly still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the universe to provide an answer. In that silence, you feel it, a ripple in the air. It is not a shape so much as a distortion, like the way heat rises from a summer road but remains suspended in midair. It is a heat shimmer, a pocket of blurred atmosphere that vibrates with a low, humming frequency, a sound you feel in your teeth more than you hear in your ears. It doesn't have a face or limbs. It looks like a piece of liquid glass caught in a permanent state of melting. It hangs there, shimmering between existence and non-existence. You reach out to touch the cave wall, and as your hand moves toward the shimmering patch, the air seems to thicken. The atmosphere becomes viscous, almost syrupy. The camera tilts down again, locking onto the shimmer with mechanical intensity. It is growing larger, expanding with a slow, rhythmic pulse like a beating heart made of light. It isn't moving across the floor. It is simply existing in one spot, yet its presence feels heavy, like an invisible weight pressing against your chest, making it harder to draw a full breath. You find yourself holding your breath, terrified that any sound might cause it to solidify or shatter into 1,000 pieces. But it remains as steady as a frozen lake. You feel the pull of it, a magnetic lure drawing your fingers forward. Then comes the moment of contact. As you extend your right arm into the distortion, the heat shimmer doesn't just envelop your hand. It wraps around your wrist like a warm, wet silk ribbon. It isn't smooth. It feels textured, like thousands of tiny, microscopic beads of water vibrating against your skin in a frantic, joyous dance. The temperature spikes instantly. Your skin turns a faint pink where the shimmer grips you, and, for a second, you feel a sensation of being pulled inward, as if your wrist were being swallowed by a drop of honey. You try to pull back, but it holds firm. It is a gentle grip, yet possessive, as if the shimmer were trying to memorize the shape of your skin. You look at the camera one last time before you do. The lens has turned completely away from you now, focusing entirely on that small point of contact where your flesh meets the shimmer. It watches with mechanical intensity as the heat shimmer gives a final, microscopic pulse. Then, just as quickly as it arrived, the shimmer contracts, pulling inward until it is nothing more than a tiny bead of vibrating warmth resting against your skin. The heavy weight on your chest lifts. You are left alone in the cave, the camera still staring at that empty spot on the wall where the shimmer had been. The storm outside dies down to a whisper, but the feeling of being watched remains. When you finally reach out to touch the spot again, the heat shimmer is gone, but your wrist remains perfectly warm, as if it were still being held by something just out of sight. The reviewer who stayed. I am the last one to write this. If you are reading these words, it means you have finally managed to do what everyone else failed to achieve. You left the platform. The rain is steady, a rhythmic drumming that seems to sync with your heartbeat as you stand on the weathered wood of the station. It is an unmanned stop, miles from the nearest village, where the grass grows tall and heavy with moisture. Most travelers pass it at high speeds, but once you step off the train and onto that platform, the world feels like it holds its breath. At first, there was nothing but the smell of wet earth and the distant hum of the rails. Then I felt it, the itch on my left forearm. It started as a tiny prickle, then bloomed into a jagged, angry scar. The strange thing is that I never actually got hurt. There was no falling branch, no scrape against a stone, no sharp edge to leave its mark. Yet there it was, a violet-hued line of puckered skin, branching out like a river delta from my elbow toward my wrist. It appeared the moment I stepped onto the platform, and as the rain continued to fall, the scar began to move. It didn't just sit on my skin, it crawled. Every few seconds, a new branch would sprout, weaving through the pores of my arm like tiny roots seeking water. The further the scar traveled, the more the air around me seemed to thicken, as if the humidity were turning into syrup. That was when I heard the first sound, not a footfall, but a soft, wet friction, like silk being dragged over velvet. From the mist at the end of the platform, it emerged. It wasn't a ghost or a shadow. It was a figure built from the scraps of my own faulty memories. It had the face of a woman I once saw in a dream, but could never quite place, a face composed of every detail I had slightly misremembered over the years. Its skin was the color of a bruised plum, and its hair was not hair at all, but a collection of frayed threads that looked like the edges of old maps. It didn't have a nose so much as a slight indentation where it felt like there should be one. Most striking were its eyes. They weren't spheres, but rather shimmering patches of iridescent oil that shifted colors whenever I blinked. The entity moved toward me with a strange, gliding gait, its body swaying in a way that defied the laws of gravity. It didn't speak, but as it drew closer, the scar on my arm began to pulse in time with its movement. The violet lines were no longer just on my skin. They were beginning to bleed into the air around me, turning into thin ribbons of light. "Are you staying?" it asked, though its mouth didn't move perfectly to match the sound. The voice was a layered harmony of 3 different tones. I tried to speak, but my throat felt as though it were filled with warm sand. The figure reached out, and instead of a hand, it offered a limb that resembled a cluster of smooth river stones joined by flexible tendons. When its hand touched my shoulder, the scar on my arm surged forward, racing toward my chest like a wildfire. It felt like a cold needle stitching itself into my ribs. The figure leaned in, and for a moment, I saw the truth of it. It was a physical manifestation of everything I had almost forgotten. Its face shifted again. Now it had the curve of a smile I'd seen in a photograph, but couldn't remember the name of. It grew taller, its map thread hair lengthening until it brushed the wet wood of the platform. The rain intensified, turning into a heavy downpour that seemed to muffle everything except the sound of the scar growing. Each new branch of the violet mark felt like a memory being pulled from my mind and pinned onto my flesh. I realized then why previous travelers never left. They didn't just see the entity, they became part of its construction. The scar wasn't an injury, it was a debt. As the figure pressed its oil-slick eyes against mine, the violet lines finally reached my collarbone, anchoring me to the wood. My feet felt heavy, merging with the grain of the platform as if I were becoming a permanent fixture of the station. The entity let out a soft sigh that sounded like whined through a keyhole, and then it simply stepped back into the mist, its form dissolving into 1,000 frayed threads. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching the rain wash over my skin. Eventually, the heavy weight on my chest lifted, and my feet were free. I took one step forward, then another, and finally found the strength to walk toward the edge of the platform where the train waited. I stepped into the carriage, and as the wheels began to grind against the tracks, I looked down at my arm. The scar was no longer just a mark on my skin. It had settled, becoming a permanent map of that moment in the rain. The entity is still there, waiting for the next person to step off the train and let their skin be rewritten. The Ceiling Watcher of Ward 9. I never intended to be the one to explore the condemned upper floor of St. Jude's Asylum, but my friend Elias insisted. He was a cartographer of the macabre, obsessed with mapping spaces that were no longer inhabited by humans. We had spent 3 hours on the lower levels, where the air smelled of antiseptic and old wax, but the 4th floor, Ward 9, was different. It was a graveyard of architecture, a place where the ceiling had begun to peel like sunburnt skin and the floorboards groaned under the weight of silence. To keep us synchronized in the labyrinthine layout, we used a shared location map on our phones. Each of us had a glowing dot representing our position. I liked the way it allowed me to feel his presence even when the shadows grew thick enough to swallow my own vision. We reached the long corridor of Ward 9. The walls were lined with heavy oak doors, many of them hanging off their hinges like broken teeth. Elias stopped near a massive, arched doorway that led into a circular chamber. "Stay here for a second," he whispered. He stepped through the archway into the room to check the height of the vaulted ceiling. I watched his blue dot move forward on my screen. Then he stood perfectly still. "I'm just going to observe the architecture for a minute," he said. He stayed motionless. On my map, his dot was a steady, unmoving pulse of sapphire light. I decided to walk back toward the main hall to check the coordinates of the previous room. I moved steadily backward, my boots clicking against the stone. As I retreated, I glanced at the doorway he had just passed through. For a split second, something shifted. The dot on my map flickered. It didn't move forward or back. It simply expanded slightly, as if its diameter had widened. When I looked back at the archway, there was nothing there but the empty frame of wood and stone. I took 3 more steps away. Then I saw it. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a silhouette of deep, bruised purple that seemed to have weight. It occupied the doorway like a smudge of ink. Most unsettling was its posture. While most shadows follow us by mimicking our shape, this one had hinged backward at the waist. Its lower body remained anchored in the doorframe, but its upper torso leaned back at a sharp 45-degree angle, pointing toward the ceiling. It didn't have a face so much as a series of vibrating ridges that caught the dim light. I froze. "Elias, did you just?" I started, but he was still in the other room. He hadn't moved. The shadow had simply appeared. I took another step back. The shadow followed. It didn't glide. It transitioned from the door to my heels with a subtle, wet sliding sound. As it moved, it maintained that strange backward lean. It wasn't looking at me. It was watching the ceiling of the hallway, its upper body swaying slightly as if it were tasting the air above us. Its surface texture looked like crumpled velvet, and tiny, crystalline protrusions lined its spine. I felt a prickle of unease on my neck. I started to walk faster toward the stairs. The shadow kept pace, staying exactly 3 feet behind me. Every time it moved, it stayed hitched at the waist, its heavy upper half swinging like a pendulum. It was a constant observer of the overhead rafters, yet it remained tethered to my wake. "Elias, come here," I called out. My voice echoed off the peeling plaster. He emerged from the circular room, his face bright with surprise. "I thought you were still in there," he shouted. He stopped dead when he saw me. Then his eyes traveled past my shoulder to the shadow lurking behind me. It was right in the middle of the doorway I had just crossed. Its upper body was tilted back so far that its head, a cluster of glowing, amber spheres, was almost touching the wall. "What is that?" Elias whispered. He reached out a hand, but as his fingers touched the shadow's velvet surface, it didn't feel cold or hot. It felt like static electricity jumping against skin. The shadow reacted instantly. It didn't jump forward. Instead, its waist hinge snapped straight, and the upper half rotated 180 degrees to face us. The amber spheres pulsed with a rhythmic, thrumming sound, like a distant heartbeat. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it folded back into its backward lean and retreated into the doorway. We didn't wait for another explanation. We turned and ran toward the exit, our breathing heavy in the hollow space. Even as we fled, I kept my eyes on the map. Elias's dot moved with him, but there was a second dot, a faint, flickering violet speck, that followed us from a distance. It wasn't just following us anymore. It was trailing behind like a loyal hound, always leaning back to watch the ceiling of wherever we stood. We reached the ground floor and burst into the sunlight, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind us with a final thud. We were safe in the bright, open courtyard. But as I looked down at my phone one last time, the violet dot was still there, hovering just outside our perimeter. It didn't move toward us. It stayed perfectly still, hinged backward, watching the ceiling of the world we had left behind. The pressure of the Loom. Log entry 402. The descent into the trench of size was supposed to be a routine exercise in steady depth, but at 4,000 meters, the primary pressure gauges began their disagreement. The external thermometer insists we are freezing, the internal barometer claims we are being crushed by an invisible weight, and the chronometer has begun to stutter, skipping seconds as if time itself were snagging on a jagged reef. We are trapped in the belly of the iron whale, suspended in the velvet blackness where the light of the surface is a forgotten dream. I am sitting in the command pod, my breath forming small clouds of frost against the reinforced glass. To my left, the primary monitor remains active, capturing a live feed of the cabin behind me, the galley area where our supplies are stacked. It is a strange choice for a dive log to focus on the rear, but when the external world becomes a void, the interior becomes our entire universe. At first, the screen recording was steady. I watched a single copper kettle hang from its hook, motionless. Then, during minute 12 of the stall, the kettle moved. It didn't swing. It drifted 3 inches to the right as if pulled by an invisible magnet. I frowned, checking for a structural tremor, but the hull remained perfectly still. In minute 15, a stack of tin plates shifted, sliding toward the floor with a muted metallic thud that echoed in the cramped space. By minute 20, the galley was changing rhythmically. The chairs were migrating toward the center of the room like slow-moving planets orbiting a common sun. I felt a prickle of unease at the base of my neck. I turned my head to look behind me, but there was nothing there, only the empty shadows and the hum of the oxygen scrubbers. When I looked back at the screen, the plates were gone, replaced by a cluster of small, white stones that hadn't been there before. The motion was constant now, an escalating migration of objects fueled by some unseen kinetic force. Then, the entity emerged from the corner of the frame. It did not walk into view, it woven itself into existence. It was a creature composed entirely of discarded biological debris, thousands of strands of human hair intertwined with serrated fingernails. Its body was a tangled nest of chestnut curls and silver bristles, held together by a lattice of jagged, ivory claws. Instead of skin, it had a weave of coarse mane. Instead of joints, it had overlapping layers of cuticles and cracked tips. It moved with a dry, clicking sound, the friction of hair rubbing against nail. On the screen, it began to pull the furniture into its orbit. It reached out with a limb made of 3-foot-long braids, each tipped with a sharp, translucent nail that caught the dim glow of the monitor. I watched as it draped itself over the galley table, its mane flowing like liquid silk while its fingernails clicked against the wood like a frantic typewriter. "Is it coming for me?" I whispered to the empty pod, my voice cracking in the heavy atmosphere. The entity on the screen paused. It stopped pulling the plates. It stopped weaving the hair into new shapes. It turned toward the back of the pod, toward where my chair was situated. In the recording, a single strand of golden hair reached out from the mass, stretching toward the lens until it vibrated with tension. The clicking sound intensified, becoming a rhythmic pulse that matched my own heartbeat. I realized then that the screen wasn't just showing what was happening behind me, it was projecting the entity's awareness. It knew where the camera was, and more importantly, it knew where the viewer sat. On the monitor, the creature began to shrink its body, pulling its hair tight until it resembled a dense, furry sphere of debris. Then, with a sudden, violent jerk, it launched itself forward. The hair exploded outward, filling the frame like a burst of autumn confetti. The fingernails struck the glass of the screen with a sharp, crystalline ring. It was no longer just moving in the galley, it was occupying my space. I sat frozen as the mass of hair and nails crested over the edge of the monitor's view. It didn't have a face to speak of, but its many fingernails fanned out like the petals of a blooming flower, pointing directly at my head. The pressure gauges finally aligned, all spinning wildly toward maximum capacity as if the weight of the ocean had suddenly shifted into the room with us. The creature reached the seat beside me, its hair brushing against my shoulder like 1,000 tiny needles. It didn't have a mouth to speak, but it leaned in, pressing a cluster of serrated nails against my temple. I could feel the slight vibration of its movement through my skull. Stay still, I breathed, though I knew there was nowhere left to move. The entity took one final breath, a sound like wind moving through a forest of pine needles, and then it settled into my lap, its hair enveloping my arms in a warm, suffocating embrace. It didn't look at the screen anymore. It looked only at me. I realized then that it wasn't just a creature made of discarded things. It was a collector. And now it had found the final piece it needed to complete its collection, a new strand of hair to weave into its own crown. The inventory of the smile. I have spent my life cataloging the leftovers of the dead, finding value in what others deem disposable. As an antique dealer, I deal in provenance, the history of an object's journey through time. Last Tuesday, a local widow brought me a pair of heavy, brass-bound spectacles and a leather-bound diary from her late husband's estate. They were unremarkable until the night before the sale, when I decided to move them into my 2-car garage for final dusting. The garage was filled with the scent of cedar and old paper, a sanctuary where the relics sat in patient silence under a single hanging bulb. In the corner sat a small wooden stool, and on that stool rested an old-fashioned fitness tracker, a brass band with a glowing amber face, a peculiar heirloom I'd found tucked inside the diary's cover. I wore it to bed that night, curious about its mechanical heartbeat. It was supposed to measure the pulse of the wearer, but as I drifted into a heavy sleep, the silence of the garage felt thick, almost tactile. It wasn't just quiet, it felt occupied. I woke at 3 a.m. to a strange, rhythmic ticking, like the sound of a clock submerged in honey. I blinked my eyes open and looked down at my wrist. The amber glow of the tracker was pulsing rapidly. "How many steps have you taken?" I whispered into the darkness. The tracker hummed and displayed the number, 4,202. I froze. I hadn't moved an inch since lying down. My limbs felt heavy, anchored to the mattress by gravity, yet the tracker insisted that my body had been traversing the garage floor in a frantic marathon. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air felt colder now, smelling faintly of wet wool and ozone. I looked toward the corner where the relics were piled. "Are you walking?" I asked the empty space. I closed my eyes to dismiss the thought, but when I opened them again, the tracker had jumped. 8,500 steps. Then came the sound, a soft, wet slide, like a piece of silk being dragged across stone. It was coming from the workbench. I sat up further, my spine stiffening. Out of the shadows emerged the source of the movement. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a pocket of concentrated dimness that seemed to have leaked out of the diary and onto the floor. It moved like spilled ink, but with intent. It didn't have a body so much as a shape, a hovering mass of velvet dark shadow that pooled in the creases of a perpetual smile. This entity did not possess a face in the way we do. Instead, it was a shimmering distortion of space, and its defining feature was that wide, exuberant grin. The smile wasn't just a curve, it was a landscape of deep folds and miniature canyons. It looked as though someone had pulled the corners of a mouth back until the skin pleated into tiny, shadowed valleys. Every time the entity moved, those creases deepened, catching the light like ripples in a pond. The dimness drifted toward me, hovering just above the floorboards. It didn't have eyes to meet mine, yet I felt it observing every inch of my face. As it approached, the tracker on my wrist began to spin its gears wildly. 12,000 steps. Then 15,000. I realized then that I wasn't walking, but the entity was pulling me through the air. It didn't grab my hand. It simply expanded its smile, and the gravity of its joy began to tug at my body. The shadow mass grew larger, stretching out until it reached my chest. Its dimness felt like a cool breeze on a humid afternoon. I could hear it now, a faint, melodic hum that sounded like 1,000 tiny bells ringing underwater. "Why are you smiling?" I managed to say, my voice trembling in the vast garage. The entity didn't speak. It simply pulled its smile wider. The creases deepened until they were almost deep enough to fall into. The amber light of the tracker flickered and turned a steady, vibrant gold. I felt myself being lifted off the bed, my body suspended in the air as if floating in water. The entity circled me, its dimness wrapping around my shoulders like a heavy shawl. It wasn't heavy, but it was dense, a weight of pure, concentrated contentment. I watched the tracker, 20,000 steps. I realized with a jolt of terror that I was no longer just watching the entity, I was becoming part of its inventory. My own face began to ache as if muscles were being pulled into new positions. The corners of my mouth started to twitch, stretching outward against my will. I tried to frown, to show some resistance, but the dimness insisted on its own geometry. Finally, the entity reached out and touched my cheek with a fold of its shadow. The movement was fluid, like a curtain falling. In that instant, the ticking stopped. The tracker settled on 24,503. The dimness retreated into the corner, returning to the shadows behind the workbench. It didn't vanish, it simply became less present, leaving behind a lingering scent of old paper and damp earth. I lay back down, my muscles aching from the phantom journey of those thousands of steps. The garage returned to its heavy, peaceful silence. I reached up to touch my face in the dim light. My mouth was still stretched into that perfect, wide curve, the skin pleated into deep, beautiful valleys. Even when I closed my eyes to sleep, the smile refused to let go. The Lexicon of the Tundra. The whiteout was not a mere weather event, it was a deletion. On that vast, flat expanse of the tundra, the horizon had vanished, replaced by an infinite ceiling of ivory fog and a floor of crunching frost. I was alone, my breath blooming in small clouds before being snatched away by the wind. There were no trees to lean against, no hills to offer shelter, only the oppressive, uniform void of white. In this emptiness, my own body felt like an anchor. I kept glancing down at my left shoulder, where a peculiar birthmark had lived since my childhood. It was a messy, irregular cluster of copper-colored skin, roughly the size of a coin, looking like a spilled drop of watercolor paint. But as the hours bled into one another, something impossible began to happen. The copper pigment didn't just sit there, it shifted. At first, I thought it was an optical illusion caused by the swaying wind, but then the edges began to sharpen. It stretched and curved, the chaotic blotch organizing itself into distinct, jagged lines. By the time the moon rose, a pale sliver barely visible through the haze, the birthmark had rearranged itself into a single, perfectly formed word. Listen. I stood frozen, my hand hovering over my skin. Then, from the thick wall of white, a sound emerged. It wasn't a roar or a whistle, but a wet, rhythmic hum, like air being forced through 1,000 tiny pipes. Out of the fog crawled the weaver. It was a massive, undulating knot of tangled charging cords, some as thick as ship ropes and others as thin as silk threads. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, its head was a bulbous, glowing knot where dozens of wires converged into a pulsing amber light. One end of the mass was radiating a constant, gentle heat, like a stone left in the sun, while the other end, the searching tip, was constantly whipping through the air with frantic grace. It moved with a liquid motion, its cords weaving over and under one another as it navigated the featureless landscape. It didn't walk, it flowed. As it drew closer, the heat from its tail began to melt the snow around my boots, creating a small oasis of slush. The weaver stopped 5 feet away, its many cords vibrating with a low-frequency thrum that I could feel in my teeth. Then it spoke. It didn't have a mouth, yet a voice resonated directly into my mind, clear and slightly metallic. She died because the wind stole her breath, it hummed. My heart hammered against my ribs. The weaver wasn't talking about a person, it was speaking of me, as if I were already a memory being archived. But then, the cords on its head tightened with a dry click. No, the voice corrected itself, more insistent this time. She died because the silence became too heavy to carry. The birthmark on my shoulder flickered. The letters shifted again, rearranging into wait. The weaver pulsed with light, its threads swaying in a slow, hypnotic arc. It seemed to be measuring the distance between us, testing the density of the whiteout. She died because she forgot how to move, it whispered, the copper cords on its body tightening like a pulled bowstring. Again, the correction came instantly, as if the entity were debating with itself in real time. No, she died because she was watched by something that had no shape. The word on my shoulder blurred, and then snapped into focus. Run. I took a step back, but the ground felt soft, almost spongy, as if the tundra itself were beginning to absorb the snow. The weaver lurched forward, its searching tip sweeping toward my chest. It wasn't aggressive, it was hungry for information. It wanted to perfect the narrative of my ending. She died because she stood still in a world that refused to stop, it murmured. My birthmark spun like a kaleidoscope before settling on the final word, V. I realized then that the entity wasn't just describing my death, it was choreographing it, weaving my existence into its own tangled web of wires. The weaver leaned in, its amber light bathing my face in a warm, honeyed glow. It reached out with 3 primary cords, wrapping them gently around my shoulders like a heavy, electric shawl. The heat from its body seeped into my bones, making the freezing tundra feel irrelevant for a brief moment. She died because she was found, it whispered finally, the voice now a perfect, resonant chime that echoed through the whiteout. The cords tightened, pulling me toward the glowing nod of its head. I felt my own breath slow, my vision beginning to blur as the copper birthmark on my shoulder began to glow with the same amber light as the weaver's heart. It didn't say died anymore. It simply hummed a single, vibrating note that signaled completion. The whiteout closed in around us, erasing the ground, the sky, and the distance until there was nothing left but the heat of the cords and the steady pulse of the light. When I finally closed my eyes, the word on my shoulder didn't change. It simply grew larger until it covered my entire back, reading, Here. The weaver pulled me into its center, and as my head merged with the glowing knot, I realized the entity wasn't just telling my story, it was becoming the thread that held my body together. When the last of my warmth was sucked into its glowing core, the whiteout finally fell silent. But beneath the surface of the snow, a new set of cords began to twitch, searching for the next thing to weave into the story. The dial tone of the deep. The fairy groaned, a massive iron beast slicing through the churning Atlantic. I stood on the observation deck, my coat collar turned up against the stinging spray. The storm was a violent symphony of crashing waves and howling wind, isolating us in a world of charcoal water and white foam. Because of the gale, the other passengers had retreated into the warmth of the lower lounge, leaving me alone with the rhythmic thrum of the engine and the salt-heavy air. I pulled my phone from my pocket to check the time, but as the screen lit up, I noticed something peculiar about my call log. There were 12 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, a string of digits that looked like a heartbeat in code. I hadn't dialed them, yet they sat there, pulsing with a strange finality. My thumb hovered over the first one. I decided to press it just to see if a voice would answer. The line remained silent for 3 seconds before a low, vibrating hum emerged, sounding less like a human voice and more like a cello string being pulled underwater. Then, a sound came from directly behind me, a soft, wet intake of breath. It wasn't mine. I turned slightly to the left, and that was when I saw it. Standing near the railing was my reflection in the large, reinforced glass pane separating the deck from the interior cabin. At first, I thought it was just me staring back, but as I shifted my weight, I realized the movement wasn't perfectly synchronized. The reflection stood about 3 inches taller than I did, its posture slightly more upright, and it leaned toward me with an intense, hungry eagerness. It didn't have my face exactly. Its features were slightly sharper, like a sculpture carved from wax that was beginning to melt. Its skin had the texture of damp velvet, and instead of my usual brown eyes, it possessed wide, amber irises that seemed to glow with a faint internal light. It didn't just mimic me, it anticipated me. When I blinked, it waited a fraction of a second before closing its own lids. When I exhaled, it inhaled sharply as if drinking in the air I had just discarded. The more it watched me, the more my phone began to behave erratically. New calls started appearing on the log, numbers I hadn't dialed, but the timestamps were moving backward. It was as if the future was calling from the past. Every time a new number appeared, the reflection would twitch. It grew taller with each entry, its torso elongating until it looked less like a man and more like a graceful, swaying reed. I felt a sudden urge to speak, but the words seemed to be pulled from my throat by an invisible thread. My mind began to fill in the blanks of sentences I hadn't even started yet. The water is, my brain whispered before I could think of a verb. The reflection's lips moved, forming the word heavy. Then, without me consciously deciding, my internal monologue continued. It wants to, followed by the reflection leaning forward until its nose almost touched the glass. It provided the conclusion. Taste. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried to step back, but my feet felt heavy, as if the deck itself were trying to pull me toward the water. The reflection didn't just copy my retreat. It surged forward, pressing its velvet-textured face against the glass with such force that a faint mist formed between us. It wasn't just mirroring my body anymore. It was stealing my intentions. I realized then that the call log wasn't a record of past actions, but a countdown of its arrival. The numbers were decreasing, and each time one vanished, the reflection grew more substantial, its edges becoming sharper against the blurred background of the storm. It reached out a hand, not my hand, but a version of it with 4 joints instead of 3, and pressed it against the glass in perfect unison with mine. But while my palm was flat, its fingers curled slightly inward, as if trying to grip the very air I occupied. The wind shrieked, and for a moment, the reflection's amber eyes flared bright. It opened its mouth wide, showing rows of teeth that were slightly too many for a human jaw. My mind began to finish the final sequence. When the last number, it suggested in my head. The reflection pulled back just enough to let me see its full grin. Dies, I thought, the word appearing in my mind like a ghost-written note. The reflection mirrored the thought with a satisfied hum. There was only one call left on the log, a single digit. It sat there, blinking. I felt the glass begin to vibrate, and the air grew thick with the scent of ozone and old parchment. The reflection leaned in so close that its amber eyes filled my entire field of vision, eclipsing the storm, the ferry, and the sea. It wasn't just a copy anymore. It was a predator waiting for its turn to step out of the frame. Then, with a sound like cracking ice, the last number vanished. The reflection didn't wait for me to move. It reached through the glass, its velvet hand emerging into my world, fingers wrapping around my shoulder to pull me into its side of the pane. I felt its grip firm, slightly cold, and smelling faintly of deep-sea salt. It pulled me forward until our foreheads touched, and in that moment, I realized why it had been so eager all along. It wasn't just watching me, it was waiting for me to be replaced. As my body slipped through the surface of the glass into the cold, dark interior, the reflection stepped out onto the deck, its amber eyes scanning the horizon as it took my first breath in a world that no longer belonged to me. The Watchman's blind spot. 2:14 a.m. Shift start. The air in the front office of Vaults and Vestiges smells of floor wax and old cardboard. It is a quiet, cavernous space where the rows of steel units stretch into the shadows like a graveyard of forgotten belongings. I have my clipboard, my flashlight, and the heavy brass key to the main gate. My instructions are simple. Patrol the aisles every hour. Do not let the dust settle too heavily. The facility is mostly empty tonight, save for the low hum of the overhead lights. I sit at the desk for a moment, watching the clock. It feels peaceful, yet there is a weight in the silence. 3:12 a.m. Checkpoint 1. I step out into aisle 4. The flashlight beam cuts through the gloom, revealing dust motes dancing like tiny planets. At the far end of the row, Unit 402 stands slightly ajar. It is a small unit, likely containing linens or books. As I pass it, I hear a soft thud from the ceiling. I stop and look up. Nothing moves. The silence returns, thick as velvet. 3:55 a.m. Checkpoint 2. I move to aisle 9. This is where the heavy machinery was stored last month. It feels colder here. I notice a strange marking on the floor, a smear of moisture that wasn't there before. When I shine my light toward the back, I see it for the first time, a lump of shadow near Unit 92. It doesn't have a shape yet, just a density in the air. I blink, and it seems to shift slightly left. Or perhaps it didn't move. Perhaps it only moved when I wasn't looking at it. 4:38 a.m. Checkpoint 3. The shadows are deepening. I find myself walking faster now. Every time I turn my head to scan the units, the lump of shadow seems more defined. It is a creature of geometry and grace. It lacks a traditional face. Instead, it has a smooth, porcelain-like surface where a forehead should be, textured with tiny, raised ridges like a thumbprint. Its body is elongated, resembling a piece of driftwood carved into a curve. Most striking are its limbs, fore-heavy, jointed knees that protrude from its sides. These knees do not point forward. They flare outward at 90-degree angles, pointing left, right, up, and down simultaneously. 5:21 a.m. Checkpoint 4. I stop in the middle of aisle 12. The creature is closer now. It is crouched near a stack of crates. I focus my flashlight directly on its back. It remains perfectly still, frozen like a statue of ivory and bronze. "Are you there?" I whisper to the empty air. It doesn't respond. I turn my head to the left to check Unit 1204. When I look back at the creature, it has lurched forward 3 feet. It didn't glide, it stepped with a rhythmic, clicking sound, its foreknees folding inward then snapping outward as it advanced. 6:05 a.m. Checkpoint 5. The pacing is accelerating. I am starting to feel a slight pressure in my ears. The creature is now halfway down the aisle. I try to keep my eyes locked on it, refusing to blink. It stays motionless, a strange, knobby shape against the gray wall. But the moment I squeeze my eyes shut for even a heartbeat, I hear the click-clack of its movement. When I open them again, it has moved another 5 feet, closer to me. It seems to be hunting my peripheral vision. 7:12 a.m. Checkpoint 6. I am walking backward now, trying to keep the creature in my direct line of sight at all times. It is tall, nearly 7 feet when it stretches its knees upward. Its skin has a matte finish, like unglazed clay, and it carries no tail or wings. Just that primary body and those 4 defiant knees. I find myself holding my breath, terrified to look away even for a millisecond. "Don't move," I command it. It remains steady. I glance at the ceiling. It is still there. 8:45 a.m. Checkpoint 7. The atmosphere has changed. The hum of the lights has been replaced by a rhythmic breathing, not from me, but from the creature. It is exhaling a faint, cool mist that smells of whetstone. I am in aisle 3 now, and it is only 10 feet away. Its knees are vibrating slightly, pointing toward the corners of the room as if trying to touch everything at once. Every time I blink, it closes the distance. It is no longer just a shape, it is a presence. 9:30 a.m. Checkpoint 8. Panic begins to set in. I realize that when I look directly at it, it feels patient, almost dignified. But when I turn my back, it moves with a frantic, spider-like speed. It doesn't just walk forward, it rotates its body while keeping its knees fixed in their outward directions. It is navigating the space by unfolding itself. I find myself spinning in circles, trying to catch it in a permanent state of being seen. 10:15 a.m. Checkpoint 9. The creature is now right in front of me. Its porcelain-like surface reflects the beam of my flashlight. It has no mouth, yet I can hear a faint grinding sound, like stones rubbing together inside its chest. I stand perfectly still, staring at the way its 4 knees point toward the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. It is so close now that I can feel the coldness radiating from its clay-like skin. I am terrified to blink. If I blink, it will reach out. 11 a.m. Checkpoint 10. The sun begins to bleed through the high windows of the warehouse, signaling the end of my shift. The creature is mere inches from my face. Its ridges are sharp and distinct. I take a deep breath and prepare to step back toward the office for the final time. Just as my foot lifts, I realize it has been waiting for me to look away one last time. I blink. In that split second of darkness, I feel a heavy, cool weight settle onto my shoulder, and the grinding sound inside its chest stops perfectly with my heartbeat. The inheritance of the misplaced limb. The airport terminal was a hollow ribcage of steel and glass, breathing out the hum of distant machinery. My flight had been delayed by 6 hours, leaving me stranded in Gate 42 during the transition between the evening rush and the midnight silence. Most passengers had retreated to their pods or wandered off into the bowels of the transit hub, but I found myself sitting alone in a row of empty seats near a towering wall of windows. The lighting was dim, cast in a sickly amber hue that made the linoleum floors look like bruised skin. I sat for what felt like an hour, watching my own reflection in the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror mounted against the far wall. It was a heavy, gilded thing, its frame slightly tarnished by years of humidity. At first, it simply mirrored the cavernous hall, the rows of chairs, the hanging signs, and my own slumped posture. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, the reflection began to deviate. The terminal in the mirror started to change. Instead of hard plastic seats, the reflected floor was covered in plush, velvet rugs of a deep forest green. Instead of the fluorescent lights, there were chandeliers dripping with crystalline beads that didn't exist in my actual surroundings. I leaned forward, my nose nearly touching the glass, and realized that while I sat in an airport, the mirror held a sprawling, Victorian-style parlor. There was a fireplace in the reflection that roared with blue flames and a heavy oak table where several porcelain teacups sat arranged in a perfect circle. It wasn't just a different room. It was a house I had never stepped foot in, yet my reflection moved within it as if it were home. I reached out to touch the glass, and for a moment, my fingers felt the warmth of the reflected fire instead of the chill of the terminal air. That was when I noticed him sitting in one of the chairs near the fireplace. He wasn't quite human, but he was undeniably a person-shaped thing. His body was a masterpiece of architectural errors. Instead of his head resting on a neck, his head sat perched squarely on his left shoulder like a decorative ornament. It was a bulbous, smooth sphere of mottled copper skin, featuring 3 vertical slits instead of 2 eyes and a wide, unmoving mouth that looked like a seam in a glove. His torso was elongated, ribbed like the underside of a mushroom, and his arms were thick and stubby, ending in hands with 4 square-shaped digits on each palm. He wasn't moving much, but every time I blinked, he shifted his weight, his head rolling slightly on its shoulder joint as if trying to find a better vantage point. Suddenly, the entity looked up at me. It didn't have eyes to blink, yet the slits seemed to narrow in concentration. From the reflection, a voice drifted out, not into my ears, but directly into my mind, echoing like a vibration in water. "The house is open," it whispered. I sat bolt upright. The terminal felt colder now, as if the heat were being sucked into the glass. The entity stood up, its movement slightly jerky, and began to walk toward the surface of the mirror. With every step he took in the parlor, a new clause appeared in my mind, as if he were reading a legal document aloud from his own silent lips. To the traveler who sits in the chair, he murmured, "You may enter the room, provided you leave your shadow behind." He moved closer until his copper face was nearly touching my reflected nose. The velvet rugs began to ripple like water. And to the one who watches from the outside, he continued, his voice gaining a rhythmic cadence, "You may observe the fire, but only if you do not let the house notice you are watching." He paused, his head rotating a full 180 degrees on its shoulder while his body remained facing me. And finally, he whispered, his copper face wrinkling around the seam of his mouth, "Anyone who enters must promise to never speak the name of the room." I held my breath, afraid that even thinking the word would break the spell. The entity reached out a stubby arm and pressed a hand against the glass from the inside. Where his palm met mine, the mirror didn't just reflect, it rippled like a pond hit by a pebble. I felt a tugging sensation at my chest, as if the house were trying to inhale me into its velvet depths. The blue flames in the reflection flared bright, and the sound of a door creaking open echoed through the empty terminal. Then, with a sudden, violent jerk, the entity leaned forward and pulled. The glass didn't break, it stretched. I felt my weight shift, my feet sliding forward as if walking on ice. My surroundings, the steel beams, the distant hum, the smell of jet fuel, began to blur into the scent of old paper and wood smoke. The transition was nearly complete when a small, white marble rolled out of the mirror and onto the actual linoleum floor of the terminal. It bounced once, twice, then came to rest near my shoe. I was still standing in Gate 42, but the reflection remained behind me, now showing an empty parlor with a single chair left occupied by a lingering warmth. The entity was gone, tucked back into the house he owned. I took a deep breath and looked down at the marble. It wasn't just a stone, it was a tiny, perfect replica of the entity's head, still copper-skinned and three-slithed. I realized then that the house hadn't just let me visit, It had traded something for my attention. As I turned to walk away toward my gate, I felt a weight on my shoulder, not a physical weight, but the sensation of something watching from behind. I glanced at my shadow on the floor and gasped. While I was standing perfectly still, my shadow wasn't following my lead. It was reaching out toward the mirror, its head tilting as if trying to find its way back into the parlor. The weight of the absent vessel. Sit down, please. You can't leave just yet. The bus won't be here for another hour, and I find that once you hear a story, your legs tend to become heavy as lead until it reaches its end. My story begins in the high plains of the north, where the wind doesn't just blow, it hums. I was hired as a technician for a massive offshore wind farm, but my specific job was the maintenance of the service sheds, small, sturdy outposts nestled between the towering white giants that churned the air. One Tuesday, during a particularly violent gale, I found myself inside Shed 42. It was an old structure, smelling of grease and salt, housing the heavy tools we used to keep the blades spinning. The turbines outside were groaning, a rhythmic, metallic weeping sound that vibrated through the floorboards. I sat on a stool in the corner, trying to shield my face from the spray, when I noticed the dust. It was a thick, velvety layer of sediment covering every surface, except for one peculiar spot on the workbench directly in front of me. There was a perfectly clean rectangle about the size of a large book, where no dust had settled at all. It looked as though something heavy and rectangular had sat there for decades, but when I reached out to touch it, my palm met nothing but bare wood. The area was empty. Yet, even though there was no object there, the surface felt different. It felt occupied. As I watched that clean patch, a strange sensation began to prickle at the back of my neck. It wasn't just visual, it was tactile. My own skin began to react. Specifically, the skin on my right forearm started to twitch. It felt as though someone had just pressed a warm, smooth stone against my wrist, but there was no stone in sight. I rubbed the skin, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the nerves, but the sensation intensified. It wasn't a ghost of a touch. It was a memory of a touch that belonged to me, yet I had never experienced it. It felt like a lingering pressure from an object that existed in that room only a moment ago, or perhaps 1,000 years ago. I leaned closer to the dust-free rectangle on the bench. The air above it seemed to shimmer slightly, distorted by a faint temperature drop. Then, the silence of the shed changed. The groaning of the turbines outside muffled into a low thrum, and for a second, the shed became perfectly still. That was when I saw the outline appear in the dust surrounding the clean patch. It wasn't just a rectangle anymore. A faint, shimmering border began to expand outward, marking the footprint of something larger. It looked like the silhouette of a heavy, ornate vase with a flared lip and a textured surface, an object I had never seen before, yet my arm felt it instantly. The skin on my forearm didn't just feel a pressure, it felt the specific texture of that invisible vase. It felt cool, slightly grainy, and incredibly solid. I reached out my hand, hovering my palm over the empty space where the vase should have been. As my fingers brushed the air, I felt the distinct curve of its rim. My skin recoiled as if it were actually touching ceramic. Suddenly, a sound echoed, not a voice, but a soft, resonant clink, like two pieces of porcelain meeting. The shed seemed to hold its breath. I realized then that the vase wasn't just an object, it was a physical memory of the room itself. But as I sat there, the pressure on my arm became heavier. It began to pull. My forearm didn't just feel the weight of the vase, it started to be drawn toward the empty space. The skin stretched, reacting to an invisible gravity. I felt the phantom object begin to rotate, a slow, deliberate turn in the air. The clean patch on the workbench grew slightly larger as the vase expanded its presence. It was no longer just sitting there, it was leaning toward me, tilting its invisible weight into my personal space. Every time it shifted, my skin hummed with the vibration of its movement. I felt a sudden, sharp prickle on my shoulder too, a new sensation. Something else was appearing. A smaller, circular mark in the dust began to form near my elbow, and my skin there started to feel the tickle of something small and round, like a marble rolling across a silk sheet. The vase was moving closer now, its invisible presence becoming so dense that it felt like I could reach out and grab a handle that wasn't there. My arm felt heavy, almost burdened by the weight of this object I couldn't see but whose existence my body refused to deny. Then, the most unsettling thing happened. The vase stopped rotating. It stayed perfectly still for 3 seconds, then it did something unexpected. It sank. It didn't just move down, it pushed into the wood of the bench, and as it did, the skin on my arm buckled inward, following its lead. It was as if the object were sinking into the very fabric of reality, pulling my flesh along with it. The pressure became immense, a constant, steady weight that felt like holding a heavy secret in your hand. I realized that the vase wasn't just an empty space, it was an anchor. And for some reason, my arm had become its permanent companion. I stood up to leave, but as I did, the vase didn't stay on the bench. It stayed attached to my arm, a phantom weight that followed me like a loyal shadow. Even now, as I sit here in this station, my arm feels heavy. If you were to look at it, you would see nothing but skin and bone, but if you touched it, you would feel the undeniable, solid presence of a vase that only I can carry. It is still there, waiting for me to put it down, though I suspect that once I do, it will find a new owner to remember its weight. But as the bus pulls up and I prepare to stand, my arm feels the first sharp tug of the vessel, a sudden, violent pull from the empty air, as if the vase is no longer content to be carried and has decided, at last, to begin pulling me into its own invisible center. The Cartographer of Lost Roads. I have lived in the boiler room of the St. Jude Sanatorium for 3 months, though most people forget that a sanatorium has a basement at all. It is a cavernous space of weeping brick and hissing steam pipes, where the air tastes of wet iron and ancient dust. I am not alone here. I am accompanied by the voice. It doesn't have a face, but it has a personality, a steady, melodic navigation system that speaks from the shadows of the furnace. For years, I thought it was just an echo of the building, but then the postcards started arriving at my sister's house in the village. My sister is 3 towns away, yet she receives a new card every morning. The strange thing is that they arrive out of chronological order, and though I wrote them, the handwriting changes with every single one. Each postcard captures a moment where I am walking through the subterranean tunnels, following the voice's directions. In the beginning, the postcards were simple. They described the textures of the walls, the way the bricks felt like velvet or sandpaper. But as the months passed, the content shifted. The voice began to lead me onto roads that do not exist on any map of the surface world. It isn't just a basement. It is a labyrinth of phantom thoroughfares expanding beneath the foundation. One day, I wrote, "I am walking down a path where the ground feels like sponge." The next day, my sister received the card for the following week, written in a jagged, shaky script. "The sponge has turned to glass, and my shoes make no sound." As I descended deeper into the boiler room's secret arteries, the voice became more insistent. It doesn't just tell me where to go, it commands me to keep moving, even when there is nothing to see. It spoke of the velvet cul-de-sac and the bridge of sighing steam. I found myself navigating turns that felt impossible, right angles that stretched for miles, and curves that looped back into themselves until the walls began to hum. The voice was constant, a calm, buttery tone that vibrated in my chest cavity. It would whisper, "Take the 3rd turn left at the weeping archway," or "Continue straight until the air smells of toasted cinnamon." The postcards started arriving in reverse order by the end of the 2nd month. My sister received the final journey first, then the middle, then the start. The handwriting became increasingly frantic, the ink smudging as if I were running while writing them. One card read, "The road is narrowing until it is only wide enough for my shoulders." Another, written in a looping, elegant script, said, "I have reached the center where the gravity pulls toward the ceiling instead of the floor." Then came the week of the Great Deviation. The voice stopped giving me landmarks and started giving me sensations. It told me to find the road that felt like waiting for a secret. I walked for hours through a corridor of white limestone, my lantern flickering against the dampness. The voice spoke with a strange new clarity. "You are approaching the intersection of the unspoken." I paused, expecting a physical landmark, but there was only more limestone. Then, the ground began to vibrate. The walls didn't just sit there, they pulsed like a heartbeat. I reached a point where the road split into 3 directions simultaneously. The voice spoke with a hint of urgency. Choose the path that remembers your name. I hesitated, but then I stepped onto the rightmost lane. The ground became soft, yielding under my weight like heavy moss. The walls were no longer brick. They were made of iridescent scales that shimmered in the dim light. As I walked, the voice hummed a low, resonant note. You are now on the road of ancestors, it murmured. Here, the shadows move even when you stand still. I looked at my shadow and gasped. It wasn't following me. It was reaching ahead, stretching out to touch the walls before I arrived. The voice whispered, your shadow is eager to see what you cannot yet reach. My sister received that postcard with a script so thin it was barely visible on the paper. By the 3rd month, the postcards began to arrive twice a day. I was moving faster now, my pace dictated by the rhythm of the voice's guidance. The tunnels were becoming more surreal. I found a stretch of road where the ceiling was a perfectly still pool of water, and when I looked up, I could see fish with glowing fins swimming above my head. The voice guided me through the gallery of echoes, where every step produced the sound of a distant flute. I began to notice that the voice was changing its tone as we reached the deepest levels. It was no longer just navigating, it was anticipating. It would say, turn left into the Orchard of Sighs, before I even saw the bend in the path. It felt as though the road were unfolding ahead of me like a ribbon, rather than being built as I walked upon it. The postcards became shorter, more evocative. One arrived with the script of a weeping child, the trees are made of silk. Another, in bold block letters, the sky is underground. Finally, I reached the very end of the map, the place where the voice told me the journey would conclude. It was a wide, circular plaza paved with smooth river stones. In the center stood a single, towering pillar made of translucent amber. The voice grew quiet, its melody slowing down until it was almost a breath. You have arrived at the destination, it whispered. The road has ended because you have stopped looking for it. I stood in the silence of the plaza, my breath misting in the cool air. There were no more turns to take, no more phantom roads to navigate. The voice didn't speak again. I sat on a stone and waited for the next instruction that never came. My sister received the final postcard that evening. It was written in a script so clear it looked as if it had been printed by a master calligrapher. I am standing at the center, and the voice is finally listening to me. I closed my eyes and felt a slight movement behind me. I didn't turn around, but I felt the weight of something settling into the space just behind my shoulder. The voice returned one last time, no longer navigating, but simply observing. It spoke with a warmth that felt like a physical embrace. Thank you for walking. Then, from the darkness of the plaza, I heard the sound of a door opening, not a door in front of me, but a door inside my own chest. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.